Health Sciences Library and the School of Nursing have joined together to sponsor this reception and to showcase the National Library of Medicine's Pictures of Nursing, this Wordling postcard collection. This showcase collection is actually on tour in the United States, so some of you may end up seeing this collection at your own universities at some point over the next year. But the images that are displayed are a sampling of the 2,588 postcards on American nursing that are in the full collection. And these feature nursing from 1893 to 2011. So tonight we have a very special guest joining us to share information about the history of nursing and allowing us to learn more about the profession and its development. We all know the story of Florence Nightingale, but there's much more to learn about nursing and about our impact. Dr. Bridget Lusk is a nurse historian, and she's director of the University of Illinois Chicago's Midwest Nursing History Research Center. She has a special take on the history of nursing in the United States because Bridget was originally educated as a nurse in England, and so brings with her both the perspective of the British nurse and the perspective of the American nurse. So before joining the UIC faculty, she served as the chair of the School of Nursing and Health Studies at Northern Illinois University. Her own research focus is the history of nursing practice in the U.S. over the last 150 years. Her scholarly work in nursing history has resulted in multiple articles and presentations at national and international nursing and archival conferences. In 2014, she was inducted as a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing. And in 2015, she was selected for the President's Award for Outstanding Service from the American Association for the History of Nursing. Her current research involves the examination and analysis of nurses' roles in the care of patients with cancer. So please join me in welcoming this evening Dr. Bridget Lusk.
Thank you very much, really. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about history. History is really fun, but people have this bad impression that it's boring. It isn't. It's lovely. So I'm tickled pink to talk. I'm delighted to see this exhibit from the National Library of Medicine. I've heard a lot about it. We are getting it at University of Illinois Chicago next year, and I requested it months ago. So I'm just so impressed that you guys got it. Okay, so this is a picture of my mother's postcard album from 1936. My grandmother had a postcard album, which I have, but the picture isn't so attractive. So I took a photograph of my mother's because I want to talk a little bit about why postcards. Postcards were unbelievably highly used in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. People didn't have cameras. So when you went on vacation, you bought postcards and you had your postcard album that you put your postcards in. The postal service then was very, very reliable. So you could mail a postcard in the morning saying, "Can I come to dinner tonight?" And they would get it that night just before you walked in their door. So postcards, the service was reliable, it was quick, it was cheap. For most of the time you could send a postcard for a cent. So postcards were huge business around those, and they still of course continue because this Wordling collection has them for over a century. They continued, but around the turn of the century, the last century, they were highly popular. And it's amusing, I read a little bit about postcards to sort of get up to scratch on this presentation, And apparently when the postcards came out, people were bemoaning the fact that that was the end of writing letters as we know it. So, this collection, as Jackie has said, huge number of postcards by this dear man, Michael Swerdling, who was a nurse, is a nurse, I hope. The curator is Julia Hallam. She is a nurse, but she is also a PhD English person. She is English, but she teaches English at the University of Lancaster. She has a book out that she published some time ago called The Image of the Nurse, or The Changing Image of the Nurse, something like that. So she is an authority on nursing's image. I really encourage you to go to the National Library of Medicine's site. Don't bother about this URL. All you need to do is Google NLN images. You come to thousands of images, many of which are in the public domain. And then if you go nurses, you cut it down by a few thousand, then you go to his collection, and you cut it down again by a few thousand. But it is such fun. You can browse for days looking at these images. And then this exhibit, showing the popularity of these exhibits, is booked through 2020. There are 2 exhibits going simultaneously, but it's a very popular exhibit. So my first question was, and this is noted in the exhibit, is why nurses? Now my question was, so what's so great about nurses? We don't see doctors. There are a few images of doctors, because I checked. You don't see lawyers. I don't know if there's any, well, that's the National Library of Medicine, there wouldn't be. But you don't see images of other professions. You don't see images of carpenters. You don't see images of plumbers. You see images of nurses. One reason is, look how beautiful we are. Nurses wore these delectable uniforms. They wore these gorgeous uniforms. They're pictured as young. Nurses, as we know them, were invariably student nurses. And they were doing this incredible work. Their work could be interpreted as motherly and saintly. It could be interpreted as risque and sexual. If you can't read it, it says, "The doctor ordered me to bed for 3 weeks with a trained nurse." This is one of my postcards, but it's actually in the Swerdling collection as well. Their work in the newly devised career of nursing could place them in the middle of a war zone, or in a foreign land, or in the wretched confines of tenement housing among the immigrants. So plumbing, nursing was not. So tonight I want to discuss the image of nursing behind those 4x6 postcards. They were meant for public consumption. They were published and politically modified. They weren't as nurses are, they were as people would want to buy images of nurses. Nursing was a new and singular profession when it formally began in the 1870s and 80s, just after the societal upheaval of the US Civil War. Before Florence Nightingale's name, coupled with expanding scientific innovations, unified a growing progressive era movement to provide better care of the sick poor, nurses were drawn from a class of women that wasn't that great. Now there aren't many pictures of these women. They sadly, because they doubtless had very few options in life, they often rarely got their photograph taken. But these are London nurses before the time of Nightingale. They were reduced and desperate enough to undertake such singularly unattractive work. Can you imagine it? The long hours, the dirt, the rats, the cockroaches, the grime, the dying people, the pain. When the foundation stone of the New York Cancer Hospital was laid in 1884, society women were asked to volunteer their time because, quote, We may not turn over the administration of our patients to paid nurses and them alone. Now, nurses were overwhelmingly women, but unlike teachers, and as we all perhaps know, it was teaching or nursing a few years back, teaching was the other female profession, if you will, nurses dealt with the intimacy of adult bodies, and their work involved life and death. Because they were women, during an era when women were kept subordinate by being placed on a pedestal, you can figure that out, it makes perfect sense, though it sounds strange, it was difficult for society to know quite how to think of them. Women had traditionally been the natural guardians of family life and morals. They had been effectively excluded from the competitive male world of business and power outside the home. So postcards emphasized the traditional, the safe images of nursing, as we see here, as feminine, altruistic, and motherly. By doing so, they may both have reflected the public's conceptualization of nurses and also shaped the public's conceptualization of nurses. But they certainly didn't show who nurses really were. I mean, she has no blood and guts on her uniform. I was just mentioning earlier, we have several uniforms at the Illinois Training School, the uniforms of the Illinois Training School for Nurses in the Midwest History Center. And they were worn uniforms. And they didn't have deodorant in those days, so our uniforms had huge brown things, and then they have these huge brown things on the aprons, and you don't know what they are, you don't really want to touch them. But it doesn't she look angelic? So the first banner, first couple of images on the banner shows visiting nurses. They were shown as hardy women. This is one of the images from the banner. She hardy. Elizabeth McPhee. She was a Scottish visiting nurse. She was visiting houses in rural areas. There's another image there from a nurse, I believe in England, again, visiting a house in a rural area. Here is a US nurse that I think many of us are more familiar with, Mary Breckinridge. And here she is on her horseback. I mean, she's much snazzier than the motorbike, the other lady. In 1925, nurse midwife Mary Breckinridge founded the Frontier Nursing Service in an economically depressed, rural, mountainous area of southeastern Kentucky. But like the Scottish picture, Breckinridge is in transit. This is much more glamorous. We can see her, we can see her horse. What was she actually doing? Picture doesn't indicate the care she gave when she actually arrived. This is another picture actually of Frontier Nursing Service nurse. This was a postcard that was sent out to try and get money for them. Frontier Nursing Service nurses made diagnoses and treated patients in remote areas of Appalachia with the blessings of the physician committee who supervised them. Working out of 8 centers that covered 78 square miles in remote mountainous regions, the FNS nurses had considerable autonomy. They made diagnoses and treated patients, dispensing herbs and medicines, including morphine, with the permission of their medical advisory committee. Working from standing orders written by that committee, the nurses also dispensed aspirin, Ipecac, Cascara, and castor oil at their own discretion. Another pretty autonomous independent group was nurses working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In the first half of the 20th century, they were also traveling around these totally isolated reservation areas, diagnosing, treating. Other visiting nurses at that time worked in crowded urban areas, providing care for poverty-stricken immigrants in cities throughout the country. The exhibit actually shows this Chicago visiting nurse. I don't think it says she's from Chicago, but she is. She is the sort of the image of the Chicago Visiting Nurse Association, and in their offices in Chicago they have like this picture, but it's like 9 feet tall, it's beautifully painted, and it is their sort of signature image. But it is a stylistic, totally unnatural image. I mean, whoever heard of kids all being good at the same time that she's holding it? So in 1892, a Chicago VNA supervisor described the enormity of the nurse's task. No one could conceive the dirt and ignorance that the Hull House nurse, one of these Chicago VNA nurses, was attached to Hull House, which was a settlement house for immigrants, has had to contend with unless they made rounds with her. She's often had to care for a typhoid patient in a small room crowded with a dozen or more chattering, gesticulating Italian men and women, not one of whom could speak a word of English. Pigeons underfoot or flying on the bed, the whole scene so confused that it would seem impossible to do anything at all. Now, some of these nurses had been midwives. Many of the frontier nursing service were midwives. But in the racially segregated southern US states prior to the 1950s, untrained African American women, so-called granny midwives, provided the vast majority of obstetrical and nursing care. In 1940s Arkansas, granny midwives attended approximately 3/4 of all African American births. Interestingly, data from around that period show that the outcomes from these midwives was just as good as from physicians. But the common denominator of visiting nurses in both rural and urban areas was that their patients were poor. The nurse or the midwife was frequently these people's only option for medical or obstetric care. Providing care to people in underserved areas has by default been assigned to nursing throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. Moreover, history is clear that the concept of expanding the scope of practice for nurses was inextricably entwined with that assignment. There is strong argument, I think, for seeing these nurses and the midwives as the forerunners of our advanced practice nurses today. This is an image, there are no pigeons in this image, but it's an image from our collection of the VNA nurse and helping out in a family. That was a Virginia midwife, 20s or 30s, and this is another image from the VNA collection that we have at the center showing a nurse helping out. So the second banner shows nursing as a womanly mission. They represented the epitome of feminine graces. So, feminine graces personified. A picture again from our collection, Englewood Hospital Training School in Chicago, about 1895. In addition to being specifically educated to do the work of nursing, and thus replacing the ill-kempt, ignorant women before them, these trained female nurses were selfless. There was an aura of virginity, martyrdom, propriety, and obedience. In 1896, an editorial of the Journal of the American Medical Association affirmed, quote, "The whole atmosphere of the ward and clinic is purified of the form of vulgarity and rowdyishness by the silent presence of petticoats. The white-capped priestesses of dignity and purity hovering about." And we got rid of the white caps. I mean, what? Here's an image from Cook County Hospital, 1880s, late 1880s, showing the nurses from the Illinois Training School in Cook County. Indeed, the contributions that trained nurses could bring to the care of the sick, patients, rich and poor alike, was readily acknowledged in the early years of the profession. A physician writing in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1889 publicized the changing face of medical care. "The scientific methods," he wrote, "of combating disease have made a steady demand for better nursing and more intelligent nurses. Women are rapidly superseding men as nurses, even for surgical cases." In 1918, the government called all women to war service. This is an image from the display. She is actually not calling nurses to war service or women to war service. She's asking for money. You know how that is, but this is a nice picture. 1918, the government called all women to war service, but if they wanted to nurse, they had to be trained. And images of nursing proliferated. This is from a sheet of music. Images of nursing were constantly in the Saturday Evening Post, in illustrated newspapers. They proliferated in the general press, including postcards. There's hundreds of military nurses from the First World War in postcards. Nurses were viewed as knowledgeable and patriotic spokeswomen for the armed forces. I particularly like this one because the music is, the song is, "I Don't Want to Get Well." And you see what's happening outside the window and you can understand there's a much bigger reason for not wanting to get well. But what were the nurses, again, actually doing? Mary Roberts Reinhardt, a writer and nurse who actually worked as a nurse during the First World War, wrote, here's a picture from the First World War. "If his pulse fails, to stimulate him, to watch for the wicked seeping hemorrhage that may make its presence known too late, to guard him in his delirium. Such mothering as only the trained observer can give." But actually, nurses held no official position in the army whatsoever during that war. In spite of their images on hundreds of different sorts of media, they were neither officers nor enlisted personnel. And their education and experience was sometimes wasted. Here's a quote. "As the wounded and sick were being brought into a base hospital from a train, the chief nurse asked the sergeant, bring in first those who had been gassed. He replied rather gruffly, 'I don't have to take orders from you.' The gassed patients, who needed immediate attention, were left until the very last." Here is an image, I don't know if you can see it, I just found it in the National Library of Medicine. It is a postcard, patients who've been gassed, and it says slow asphyxiation in the English. Terrible, terrible form of death. I was mentioning to someone I picked up in Dublin last year a first aid kit from the First World War, and it has a jar of anti-gas ointment. And I never try and check luggage, so I had it in my luggage, so I had the anti-gas ointment in my little bag of checkable under 3-ounce liquids. And I was really nervous that they would say, "What is anti-gas?" They didn't. This image is from the Saturday Evening Post. I think, it doesn't say anywhere, but I think it's Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was the Supreme Allied Commander at the end of the First World War. Nurses were frequently pictured. Here is a child nurse, but giving him a box. The date is September 1918, giving him a first aid box, which I assumed means, "Here, I'm a nurse, here's your first aid box. Go and bandage the countries that have been devastated." I don't want to go into why she's a child. That sort of annoys me, but we won't. The third banner shows nursing as a career. As a concept of education for nursing began in the 1870s and 1880s, nursing offered incredible prestige and incredible responsibility. In an 1890 article describing the hospital for ruptured and crippled children in New York, the reader learned that, quote, "At the head of each hall is a Bellevue-trained nurse, with a force of ordinary nurses or caretakers at her command." Nursing could be a great career. It allowed women to remain unmarried, which gave them huge amounts of freedom. Look at the nuns, they did it. It enabled women to have a career, and essentially for many of them to get off the farm, to be independent. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago showcased new opportunities available to these new career women. And we have in the History Center in Chicago a letter from Mrs. Bertha Potter Palmer in which she gave $6,000. She was the president of the Board of Lady Managers of the Chicago Exposition of 1893. She gave $6,000 for a model hospital to be set up, showcasing the work of lady doctors, lady pharmacists, and lady nurses. So it was a totally female hospital, and they gave first aid to all the folk during the fair. I couldn't find an image of the hospital, it was not in the women's building, But here is an image from the nurses' display of the exposition. But what sort of career was nursing after those first few glorious years, after it had just started? It wasn't as depicted in the postcards. Firstly, the nurses that you saw in the postcard images were almost certainly student nurses. They weren't graduate nurses. When nurses graduated, they were kicked out of the hospital and they had to go work in private duty. There were very few graduate nurses in hospitals. So they then put out their shingle as a private duty nurse and went to people's homes. I have some images of just, this is from our collection. This is a set of, I think it's 26 lantern slides that we have, little glass slides, of how to make a bed in the 1880s. The nurse giving hypodermolysis, a nurse watching as a patient is getting a chest x-ray. Note, no one has any protection whatsoever. Nurses actually were advised not to hold his hand. They said just stay at the end of the bed. I love this picture. Now, my interest is in cancer nursing, and this image is from an Australian hospital in St. Vincent's in Sydney. And all the immigrants to Australia got a lot of skin cancers because of the sun. They weren't used to it. And here's a nurse on your left who has her radium in her hand, and she's giving these patients blobs of radium to hold against their skin cancers. I don't know what happened to that darling nurse, but anyway. Nursing as a career, however, for those early nurses, did offer terrific opportunities. I just glanced at the alumni of the Illinois Training School for Nurses and sort of what they did. I found one graduate, Eleanor Chestnut. She graduated in 1891, and she then obtained a medical degree. Many of the ITS graduates either obtained a medical degree afterwards or got a medical degree first. She obtained a medical degree right after that, and then she went to China. She went to China as a missionary, and as a physician, and as a nurse. She went in 1893. Well, the sad thing was in 1905 there was the Boxer Rebellion. This is an image I got off the Wikimedia site. The Boxer Rebellion, for those of you who aren't sure about it, was basically a couple of groups of Chinese people who hugely objected to the influx of Western influence in China and missionaries in China. You know, so one would say quite reasonably, these people are coming into their land, but they were totally overthrown by a consortium of about 11 European and US armies. But sadly, Dr. Chestnut was murdered by the Boxer Rebellion. Another Illinois Training School graduate who had a sort of happier ending is Theda Phelps, and this is her class. I don't know, this is her graduating class of 1902. I apologize, I don't know who she is, but she's one soul in this class of demure-looking women. She went to Turkey in 1911. Now, you know, just imagine Turkey in 1911. It's so brave, so adventurous. She became director of nursing in a small hospital and taught home nursing and first aid. She wrote many years later. During 1914 to 1917, during the First World War, I did a great deal of visiting nursing and surgical work, as there were no doctors excepting those in the military hospitals, and they were too busy for the general public. I amputated toes, opened breast abscesses, terrible ones, set broken bones, and did all sorts of work, end quote. But as we got into the years of the Great Depression, the 1930s, the outlook for nursing wasn't so good. Student nurses were hugely taken advantage of. They were admitted by the hundreds because they provided essentially free nursing care to the patients. They were the service. They were giving free nursing care. An organization reviewed nursing in the late 20s, early 30s, and some of the results were that nursing students were the most overworked students of any profession. I sort of say that to my students sometimes now, and they say, yeah, it hasn't changed. 28% of students work more than 48 hours a week if they were on day duty. 37% of students worked over 70 hours a week if they were on night duty. 2/3 of schools had no graduate nurses whatsoever at the bedside. These nurses weren't in an apprentice system, as it was commonly called, because they were not being apprenticed. There were no graduate nurses to help them out. Here's just an image. I kind of like it. You know, this is actually a recruitment brochure. It wouldn't make me steer clear of this hospital, but a recruitment brochure for St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago. So following the Great Depression, during the Great Depression, nurses couldn't get work as private duty nurses. So they went into the hospitals, basically for bed and board. They weren't getting paid a salary, which equated to being even cheaper than student nurses. And that was the start and one factor in the shift, along with increased scientific needs in the hospital, and along with the growth of insurance programs that got nursing care as graduate nurses into the hospitals and sounded the death knell for private duty nurses. So the next two banners, I kind of wanted to put them together. One talks about gender in nursing, and one doesn't specifically say race, but that is one of the major subjects in nursing. And the nurses represented in these postcards are typically white, and they're typically female. Now, certainly, the curator, Dr. Hallam, did get African-American nurses and did get male nurses in her images, but I believe that these were graduation pictures. You could go to a photographer and you could get your image, your photograph taken, and then a postcard stamped on the back. So I suspect these were not postcards you could go and buy at the corner drugstore. These were actually images for these folks to send to their parents and their loved ones. So male nurses and non-white nurses had a very difficult journey in their attempt to join the ranks of white female nurses. After their essential removal, and I'm talking now about male nurses by Nightingale's reforms, male nurses persisted in some religious orders and as male attendants for the mentally ill. But female nurses, and Jackie and I were discussing this earlier, you could sort of hit nurses in the head sometimes. Female nurses continued to lobby strongly that nursing was a feminine position, and they did not want men in it, profession, did not want men in it. Men were barred from the Army Nurse Corps after the Spanish-American War, and the Navy followed suit 10 years later in actually 1908. Men were not commissioned as nurses in the Army or Navy until 1955. In 1960, just 1% of all nurses were male. And that has been estimated that that is the lowest since nurses went out on the religious crusades in the Middle Ages. This is an image of a training school, wanted an application brochure from Los Angeles County Hospital in the mid-1920s. It actually shows two nurses, so looking at the number, shows about 8% of nurses were male. You know, if that reflects the actual student body. California was a different kettle of fish, as it so often is, and I won't go into that story, but there were many more male nurses in California than anywhere else in the US. In 1939, only 70 nursing schools in the US admitted men along with women, and just 4 admitted only men. And one of these, this image is from it, from an 1899 text. 2 of those 4 nursing schools were Alexian brothers. One was in the north suburbs of Chicago, which is this image is from, and the male nurses there were monks. Some decades later, they allowed non-monks, but initially they were just for monks. I can see some eyes are like waving a little bit, and I don't want eyes to wave, so I just want to mention that male nurses have found a niche in nurse anesthesia, and in fact, in nurse anesthesia, the pendulum swung a little bit the other way. This is the first all-male nurse anesthetist graduating class at Walter Reed General Hospital in 1961. There were a couple of all-male classes for nurse anesthetists. But other than that, the females have been pretty good at keeping out our brother nurses, which is terrible. So the exclusion of men into nursing was supported by society's norm of women as nurses and by the societal expectations of the day. In the same way, nursing's exclusion of people of colour followed societal norms of the period, clearly terrible when considered today. In Chicago, a young African-American woman approached the Illinois Training School in 1891, interested in entering the school. She was told that they would be willing to accept her for entrance if she could bring one or two other African-American young women with her so that she wouldn't be all alone. They did not hear from her again, but a few years later, according to the annual report, quote, "One of their number came to us for instruction on how to start a hospital and training school for nurses. And so was started the Provident Hospital, which has done and still is doing noble work in this city," end quote. So a picture of the Provident Hospital in Chicago, another picture again from this 1899 book on what was happening in medical institutions at Chicago at that time. This is Provident Hospital. It's a lovely picture, but it says, the title of this picture is Nurses at Recreation. What a joke. These poor guys have been on the board for 12 hours, and now they're getting taught about bed baths. So they've all got their notebooks, but one for the problem. In spite of these severe handicaps, I want to mention a couple, and there are many, but a couple of outstanding heroes to be found among the African-American nurses at the start of the last century. And this is Martha Franklin, who in 1908, she personally did not send postcards. She personally wrote 1,500 letters inviting nurses to meet in order to organize a national association for, as she called them, colored nurses, with the goal of collectively working to eliminate racial discrimination in the profession. First meeting was held in New York City that same year, 1908, and that same year, through that meeting, the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses was founded, and Martha Franklin was its first president. Another truly great nurse is Maud Callan, and she was featured in a marvelous Life magazine pictorial of 1951, and this is one image from there. She delivered in her career, she was a nurse and a midwife, over 800 babies. She taught annual midwifery institutes. She was called out to assist at all the difficult births. A midwifery student remembered, quote, "I don't know what would have happened to the people if Miss Maud had not been there." So the final banner title is The Nurse of Today. It shows more recent images of nursing. And thus, from a time of waning interest in postcards, when people could take photographs, and also there'd been introduced what we call the French folding cards, which are the greeting cards we call them today. Postcards had lost their impact. People were using the greeting cards, they were using the telephone. Much quicker, much more reliable. So kind of, we're after the heyday of nursing. This image, I don't think it's in this collection out there, but it is, if you go to the National Library of Medicine's site, Dr. Hallam does discuss this image. As you can perhaps see, it's and a black eye, add a black eye to whatever he's already got. I think it's pretty hilarious myself, but she writes, Dr. Hallam, the curator of this, writes, "This card uses two common British nurse stereotypes. The older battle axe, a frustrated spinster and strict disciplinarian, and the young, sexy nurse to create comic effect. Sexy nurses were frequently shown as worldly wise, working class, blonde women who were fair game for their male patients," end quote. Their male patients' unwanted advances. The NLM estimates that this card came out about 1950. There's another one in their collection, which is the same joke. No, I got the black eye from a nurse. There he is. He's obviously in a terrible accident, but she is giving him the black eye. My take that from these love them or hate them images is that this nurse shows a refreshing assertiveness and individuality. I think these are essential qualities for autonomy in practice, for self-assertiveness, for self-respect and independent thought, dare I say it, critical thinking. I think she's the type of nurse I want looking after me. I don't want someone who's always going to obey orders and say yes sir and no sir, whatever. Today, the postcard image has lost its mass appeal, as I said, and pictures of nursing are instead found, we could all think of several, in the television, in the movies, and through various types of social and other electronic media. But I think it remains key in order to promote optimal health and wellness of the people that are our priority in this profession. I'm starting to not like the word patients, but the people that we care for. To guard this image of nursing. Nurses need the public to see the level of care they can give in order to support efforts to practice to the full extent of our education. Authors such as Suzanne Gordon have contributed, I think, to the profession's, well, I know she has, positive image through her writing about the work that nurses do. I think this is an area of wide open opportunity for all of us. We're not on the postcards anymore, but we are on social media. We can write on Facebook. We can do a blog. We can write letters to the editor. We can write books to tell people what we do. There's big interest in getting nurses' narratives, because people just don't know what we do. This other book, The Shift, One Nurse, 12 Hours, 4 Patients' Lives, by Teresa Brown. She is a RN who also has a PhD in English, and she works in a bone marrow transplant unit, I think in New York. I just read it. We read it at my book club, non-medical book club. The book is about a typical 12-hour shift that she has worked. It's typical, it's an amalgamation. One of the non-nurse members of my book club said to me, yeah, but that's not a typical shift, is it? I mean, no one actually works that hard, do they? And I said, yes, they do. So, in conclusion, I hope that I've answered the question I asked at the beginning of this talk. Nurses were in postcards, because of the places they went to and the things that they did. They were depicted in areas where women rarely went. They were shown as sexy and they were shown as demure. But these postcards didn't show what nurses actually did. And I think this is the challenge that we still have today. Thank you very much.
I just might add one comment. Teresa Brown is actually an alum of ours, and she's here in Pittsburgh.
Okay, fantastic. What a beautifully written book. I was overwhelmed by it. Well, congratulations. I knew this was a great piece. Any others? Yes?
What caused you to get interested in nursing history?
Well, 20 years ago, I was an instructor in a nursing program. I had my master's degree, and I was told, you've got to get your doctorate. I was already pretty old, I didn't really want to. So I went to UIC, and I've always loved history, and I went to UIC, and everyone was talking about these wonderful things, and I know it's great things that you do, but it doesn't get me. And I asked if I could do it in history, and then they showed me that they had this Midwest Nursing History Research Center, which was founded in '82. So I went there, and it was pretty spooky. They showed me around, and they had like 12 mannequins. It's pretty dark, and if you didn't like mannequins looking at you out of strange corners, but I just fell in love. And it's been just a fun thing. I've enjoyed it, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.